Story 1. The invention of tetraethyl lead to prevent knocking in fuel not only likely gave the majority of the population minor brain damage, but the alternative at the time was mixing some ethanol in with the fuel. So, it likely also set biofuel technology back decades. Story 2. Toussaint Louverture sent a letter to Napoleon that directly compared the two men on equal ground. This offended Napoleon, who sent an expedition to Haiti, which was still a loyal French colony, to reimpose slavery. This led to a brutal war, which France lost, resulting in Haitian independence. With the loss of Haiti, considered the crown jewel of the French possessions in North America, Napoleon lost interest in colonies in the Western Hemisphere. This led to an idea that would generate some cash flow and also offend Britain, the Louisiana Purchase. Without that letter, the United States may have never expanded past the Mississippi River. Story 3. John Harrison, a lone genius who revolutionized open sea navigation. Until he came along, finding one's longitude, one's east-west orientation on Earth, was extraordinarily difficult. Before Harrison, it required clear skies, calm seas, a telescope, a spotter, and a lot of math. Miss one day's observation, and you're lost at sea, quite literally. Latitude is much easier to figure out from the sun's high point or from the stars. His solution to the longitude problem was to invent a timekeeper for the longitude, which was essentially a clock, more accurately a chronometer, that kept time in two places, London and on board the ship. Once high noon was reached in London, clock 1 would start at 12 o'clock. As the ship sailed west or east, high noon was measured locally, and clock 2 would be corrected at each measuring interval. The difference between the two clocks would allow the ship's crew to quickly determine their east-west position relative to London's longitude. Even today, some of the nomenclature used by seamen goes back to the minutes/hour style of speech that came from using Harrison's chronometers. The really cool thing about his clock was that it didn't utilize a pendulum, which was common in nearly every other clock at that time, because the ship's rocking motion would cause the pendulum problems. Instead, he invented a governor that would allow a flat-coiled mainspring to be released at equal force until completely unwound, attached to a series of cogs which would cause the minute hand to tick at equal intervals. The accuracy of Harrison's clock for the time was head-spinningly astounding. Transatlantic tests proved his clocks would drift in accuracy only a few seconds per month, which is astonishing for a mechanical timepiece, even today. He was supposed to receive a financial reward from England's longitudinal board for solving this issue, but sadly never received the full payout due to politics. He worked to improve his clocks for his entire life until he died, and each subsequent revision had vast improvements over its predecessor in terms of accuracy and smaller size and portability. Davis Sobel's book, Longitude. The story of a lone genius who solved the greatest scientific problem of his time, is an excellent read and doesn't take too long to read through. Highly recommended. Story 4. In the late days of the July crisis of 1914, Tsar Nicholas II and Kaiser Wilhelm had a night-long telegram exchange, known as the Willie-Nicky telegrams, since they addressed each other as Willie and Nicky, regarding the possibility of war in Europe. During this, it was revealed that neither of them wanted war, and immediately after the exchange, the Tsar phoned the Russian war chief and told him to call off the general mobilization. The next day, the Russian army's chief of staff and the Russian foreign minister, Sazonov, tried to convince the Tsar to restart Russian mobilization. During the ensuing argument, the Tsar took some time to think while staring out the window. After some time, an unknown aide whispered to the Tsar, "We know it can be difficult for you to decide, Your Majesty." This struck Nicholas in exactly the wrong way, as throughout his reign, Nicholas had been called weak and indecisive, and was seen as an incapable leader. This comment set Nicholas off, and he ordered the mobilization to resume. This single sentence, said by an unknown diplomat or aide, set the stage for the first-ever industrial war in history. Looking back, any event during the July crisis can be an answer to this question. That entire phase was just a series of hugely tragic and unfortunate events. Story 5. After the war between the United States and Mexico under President Polk in 1848, Polk wanted to take everything down nearly to Mexico City, including all of Baja, and then a line following the geography drawn east from the tip, more or less. His representative, Trist, disagreed and proposed a much lighter penalty, and headed to negotiate the terms in Mexico City, While Polk wanted the negotiations to occur in Washington, D.C., Polk sent a notice to recall Trist, essentially firing him. This being the days of travel taking weeks and being very difficult, the men sent to recall Trist never found him, and there is some likelihood that Trist actively evaded the notice. Trist defied Polk and gave us the current southern border, which he felt was just and sensible. Polk objected, but the Senate cared less about the southern border and stretches of empty desert than they did about the costs of war and occupation, and they ratified Trist's treaty. Had Polk's people found Trist, we might have incorporated half of Mexico, nearly everything north of Mexico City. Story 6. In 1931, Hitler was scrutinized for the death of his niece, Jelly, with whom he also had a strange, unhealthy fascination and obsession. She was shot in the chest with his gun in his apartment. Many people thought he was responsible for her death, but charges never stuck and the whole thing was swept under the rug after a while. Imagine an alternative history where Hitler actually went to prison fairly early on. Edited to add, I know he went to prison before this. That's where he wrote Mein Kampf. I should have said stayed or went to prison on murder charges. Something that might have kept him there. Story 7. The invention of the modern paper clip seems insignificant, but it revolutionized how we organize documents in offices worldwide. Before that, people would literally punch holes in papers and tie them together with string. My grandma worked as a secretary in the 1950s and told me how it completely changed their workflow. Story 8. We got Obama because a producer in Hollywood thought Garrett Wang was handsome. Not sure how much of this is apocryphal, but the story is that after a few seasons of Voyager, the producers wanted to shake things up a bit. They decided to change the cast but couldn't decide whether to kill off Kes, a female character, or Harry Kim. The story was that a producer decided Garrett Wang looked pretty good on a recent TV Guide cover, so the fairly boring character might still have some life in him, and Kes was written out. Since they'd gotten rid of a female character, they decided to add another, a sexy Borg played by Jerry Ryan. She was a huge hit, which raised her profile considerably. So when she divorced her husband Jack Ryan, it was news. Jack then ran for the Senate in Illinois, and details of his divorce went public and included how he pressured his then-wife to go to sex clubs. Because she was famous, this was big news, resulting in Ryan losing the primary to a little-known Barack Obama, who won the seat. All because Garrett Wang took a good picture one day. Story 9. During the 19th century, Russia occupied Poland and enforced limits on education, demanding schools teach nothing beyond what was required to be a peasant. The Polish people began underground universities. One of the many graduates of these universities was Maria Curie. Story 10. At the Battle of Midway, the Japanese destroyer Arisher stayed behind to try to sink the submarine USS Nautilus, which had been harassing the Japanese fleet all morning, while the rest of the fleet sailed on ahead. At around 10 a.m., the Arisher broke off the attack and started racing to catch up with the main fleet, which was now 30 miles away. She was soon spotted by a large squadron of U.S. dive bombers from the carrier USS Enterprise that had miscalculated their original course and were on the edge of having to return to their ships without engaging the enemy. The bombers used her to point the way to the main Japanese force and, in conjunction with a squadron from the carrier USS Yorktown that arrived over the Japanese fleet at the same time, targeted the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu just as they were getting ready to launch a major strike. Even though a fourth carrier, Hiryu, survived this attack and was able to launch a much-reduced counterstrike that caused major damage to the Yorktown, which led to her being sunk 3 days later, Hiryu was eventually hunted down and destroyed by dive bombers later on that day, completely eliminating the entire four-carrier strike force. If that destroyer doesn't stay behind, the Enterprise dive bombers don't find the Japanese carriers in time, and they manage to launch a devastating attack on the U.S. fleet, and the entirety of the Pacific War is completely altered. Story 11. Henry VIII not fathering a living son and the Pope refusing to grant him a divorce. Yes, there were issues with the Church at the time in England, but nothing large enough to drive the English Reformation that happened. It was Henry that really drove it. If he had a living son or married Mary to James V of Scotland, his nephew, when Mary was young enough to have children, it would have been different. Story 12. Not sure it would be considered overlooked, but that Russian radar officer in the Cold War saw on his screen multiple objects that could have been United States nuclear missiles. If he had reported it, the Soviets could have launched theirs at us. He kept watching, convinced it must be a mistake, and it turned out to be a glitch or something. Edit. My explanation may not be accurate, as some commenters have pointed out. Story 13. The death of Princess Charlotte of Wales in 1818. Charlotte was the daughter of George IV and was the last hope for the Hanoverian line and was very popular. After she died in childbirth in 1818, she and her stillborn son were greatly mourned. Her death made George IV's brothers leave their mistresses and many illegitimate children and marry princesses and father legitimate children. This led to a baby being born who would become Queen Victoria, also known as the Grandmother of Europe. Story 14. In 1998, a paper was published in the prominent British medical journal The Lancet, entitled Ileal Lymphoid Nodular Hyperplasia, Nonspecific Colitis, and Pervasive Developmental Disorder in Children. 12 years later, it was retracted amid reports of fraud, data manipulation, and conflicts of interest, and the author of the paper was struck off the medical register. But the damage was done. Andrew Wakefield had linked the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine to autism in the claim sense, not they actually proved a causative link or in fact proved anything at all sense, and provided fuel to several movements, including those opposed to vaccines and those that encouraged a general distrust of people proclaiming themselves to be experts. Of course, the media helped to blow his findings out to astronomical proportions. Without him, we could safely dismiss those opposed to vaccines as fringe conspiracy theorists, and Michael Gove would be somewhat less able to declare that people have had enough of experts. A lot of people who are now dead would be alive. Story 15. Cyrus the Great's decision to let the Jews return to Judea and to build the second temple for them. Without this, Judaism likely dies off as a major world religion. Without Judaism, no Christianity and no Islam. There would surely be other religions appearing to take their place and other religious conflicts throughout the millennia. But when Christianity and Islam in their many forms account for over 4.3 billion followers worldwide, it's hard to overstate how important that decision was in shaping the world forever after. Story 16. Ray Tomlinson's first email over ARPANET in 1971 was the first practical use for the newly developed file transfer protocol and predecessor of things that are now known colloquially as the Internet. Story 17. One tiny overlooked moment in history that had significant consequences was the decision by a young, unknown German soldier named Alfred Rhinland not to throw away his life on a futile charge during World War I. This event indirectly led to the creation of one of the most influential works of the 20th century, All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque. In October 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, Alfred Rhinland was ordered to lead a charge against enemy trenches. Seeing no chance of survival and questioning the senselessness of the order, he hesitated and eventually refused to go forward. This act of defiance saved his life but resulted in him being court-martialed and sentenced to death. However, due to the influence of his commander, who recognized Rhinland's mental state, the sentence was commuted to 10 years in prison. After his release, Rhinland became friends with Erich Maria Remarque, sharing his experiences from the war with him. Inspired by these conversations, Remarque wrote All Quiet on the Western Front, which provided a stark and poignant anti-war perspective that resonated deeply with readers worldwide. The novel was an enormous success, selling over 2.5 million copies in its first year alone and being adapted into an Academy Award-winning film in 1930. It played a significant role in shaping public opinion about war and has continued to influence generations of readers and thinkers ever since. This tiny, overlooked moment thus had far-reaching consequences that changed the course of history by helping to create one of the most powerful anti-war statements of all time. Story 18. One such moment was a mistake in 1962 when American pilot William Powers accidentally violated Soviet airspace, which could have led to a nuclear war. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, this incident was interpreted as an act of aggression, but it was quickly resolved thanks to personal diplomacy between Kennedy and Khrushchev. A small error in this case could have led to catastrophic consequences for the entire world. Story 19. Nero joining the Battle of the Metaurus. Hasdrubal was sent by Carthage to help his brother Hannibal fight Rome during the Second Punic War. In Italy, he sent a messenger who was captured by the Romans. Nero was one of 2 Roman field commanders. The other, Marcus Livius Salinator, was his hated rival and was about to be trapped between two Carthaginian armies. All Nero had to do was wait for his main rival to be destroyed. But Nero chose to put Rome above personal ambitions. Even had things gone differently, there is no certainty the brothers could have sacked Rome, nor is it likely they could have actually held it even had they done so. It is almost certain that Rome would have survived in some form. Carthage simply did not have the strength to conquer Rome, but the Romans would have been forced to sue for peace, which would have bought Carthage time that it did not have after Metaurus. After Metaurus, Hannibal was never again able to threaten Rome, and 5 years later would be defeated at Zama. After Zama, Carthage itself would never again threaten Rome and would be destroyed by Rome in the Third Punic War 50 years later. Had Nero chosen to stand pat, Carthage might have been given the time and resources necessary to complete their experiments in creating a new form of iron known as steel. At the time, both centers of research into steel production were in Carthaginian territory. Carthage had been working with local officials in Africa and Iberia to industrialize the process. But after the losses at Metaurus and Zama, they were too concerned about mere survival to follow up. What they had was hardly the Bessemer process, but had they developed even a primitive method for creating steel, Carthage likely would have survived, never strong enough to defeat Rome, but nonetheless too powerful to be defeated by Rome, acting as a counterweight to Roman domination throughout the Mediterranean world. Carthage was also a mercantile power, its economic strength tied to its fleet, while Rome was a land power, its wealth tied to the territory it held. Like many people and countries, Rome was at its best when faced with a powerful competitor. Competition would have forced the Romans to develop in ways they did not have to once their only serious opponent was destroyed. Given the competition for resources and markets, it might have forced the Romans to remain a republic rather than be constrained by the rigidity of empire. To meet the challenge, slaves might have been presented the opportunity to purchase their freedom, and the Praetorians never permitted such power over the succession. The Romans had already developed a form of cement, and the availability of steel would have permitted greater, more elaborate construction efforts. Larger buildings, bridges, and roads all needing something better than mere horsepower to construct on the scale which would then be possible. Roman engineers were masters of the art because stone was strong only in compression. Steel, however, was equally strong in both compression and tension, making it a far better material to use when constructing larger buildings or bridges or almost anything else. There was a problem with steel, however. With the technology available at the time, they could have made enough to create a few swords. Making it in industrial quantities, however, required a lot of heat. Fueling the blast furnaces they would have needed to create large quantities of steel would have forced them to chop down every tree in Europe or to use coal. European coal sources were usually buried and often found well below the water table. For the Romans, getting rid of the water would have been a far more troublesome issue than mining the coal. Vast amounts of water would have had to be pumped out of the mines not just constantly but continuously, or it would build up. Pumping water all the time was extremely labor-intensive. The problem was so intractable that in the timeline history actually followed, the issue was only resolved by the invention of mechanical pumps. Booms powered by steam engines. The same steam engines which would rapidly be used to power the Industrial Revolution. Nero's decision to violate his orders and rush to the aid of his rival was a tribute to his professionalism and honor. It was also a disaster for humanity in general. Had Nero chosen differently, the Dark Ages might never have occurred. The Industrial Revolution might have taken place over 1,000 years earlier than it actually did. Instead, Damascus steel would not be developed for another 1,200 years. The empire fell. All because one man chose to do his duty as his honor demanded. History had been decided along the shores of the Metaurus.